Welcome to A Deadly Silence. I'm your host, Larry Curtis, and it is the goal of all of us associated with this television show to bring to you current and educational information surrounding the alcohol and drug epidemic throughout the city of Brockton and our South Shore communities. Our guest today is Paul Doyle. Paul is a retired Drug Enforcement Agency agent. Also, he is the author of a fascinating book called Hot Shots and Heavy Hits. Paul, welcome to our show today.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
It's a pleasure to have you come in and share with us some of your experiences as a drug enforcement agent. But before we get to that, actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a drug enforcement agent?
Well, I became a drug enforcement agent in 1970. I was just finishing up my military tour. I was in the 10th Special Forces, and the Sergeant Major made an announcement at formation one day that the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs at the time were looking for young men with combat experience, with top secret clearances to work in the government as undercover agents. It piqued my curiosity. I made a phone call. I took an interview, and that's how it started.
So as a military person, you basically had received the training that was necessary to qualify you for?
No, not really,
okay.
no. But they were looking for people with clearances, obviously, and guys who had experience and were immature, I guess. And so that's what happened. That's how it came about. I wasn't. Many young people grow up always wanting to become police officers or agents. I never felt that way, you know.
Let me back up a little bit, because I read in the Boston Irish Reporter that you were actually adopted at the age of 5, and that you actually had moved 15, 16 times before your 16th birthday. And I mean, during that area of, the 60s, 70s, so forth, how did you stay out of that drug, atmosphere?
I think that I was very fortunate in many ways. I was actually abandoned as a baby. I was born in Roxbury. And if you read the book, you'll know that I was involved in a shooting, and I actually killed a drug dealer.
On Howard Avenue.
The same street I was born on.
I lived on Folsom Street, the other side of the Mary Hannon Ballpark.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, actually. So I had kind of a storied past. I lived, as I said, in Roxbury, Dorchester, South Boston, Brighton, Allston. I moved around quite a bit, and I finally my dad rented a house in Dedham, and that's where I went to high school, and that was the thing that really changed my life. I met my wife. I got a scholarship to Rutgers University, and
played football, I believe.
Yeah, I had a football scholarship, but then I turned full time to boxing. I won the heavyweight championship in New England in 1967, and actually a few ties to Brockton here. If Ali Colombo trained me for a while, I used to work out right down here at the old at the VA Medical Center. They had a complete gym there with a ring, punching bags, and I and Mike Pusateri from Dedham was a couple of years older than me, and we used to drive down every day and box and train, and so that's one of my ties to the City of Champions here. But
so you moved around as a youngster growing up throughout different neighborhoods in the city of Boston. Finally relocated in the Dedham, got some stability behind you. Graduate.
I think the thing that kept me, for some reason, I get involved in boxing at a very early age, and you can see why. You move around that often. Sometimes they change schools twice in 1 year. You're always in a fight with somebody. So I found myself at the New Garden Gym on Friend Street. It was the only gym for fighters, and that's where I actually started, and boxed in every weight class from featherweight to heavyweight as I grew up. And I think that just competing, I wanted an edge, and I couldn't see myself getting involved with drugs or alcohol, and even in those areas that I grew up in, or the times, my father, who adopted me, he struggled with alcoholism his entire life. Actually, my mother used to send me to AA meetings with him when I was a kid. I could recite, all the phrases and all
the steps and so
yeah, all the
forth,
steps, yeah. And so I always had that in the back of my mind. If I was going to box, I wanted an edge. I didn't want to, I knew I wasn't the strongest kid or the fastest kid or the biggest kid. So that's probably the thing that. And I always in the back of my mind, I felt indebted to my father and my mother, my adoptive mother and father, to be a good person,
Right.
and to not to embarrass them.
And such an interesting contrast in a chosen career to
Yeah.
avoid those types of
Right.
sins, so to speak,
Right.
and yet go in and battle
Well,
against them. Yeah.
Again, my dad fought a little bit himself, and my first trainer was actually the guy who trained him.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of threads interwoven in the story.
I did read about 2/3 of your book over the last week or so, and as I'm reading it, what was sticking out in my mind is kind of a multiple part question. I'd be curious as to your opinion, for our audience out there. As a former drug enforcement agent, what changes in the war on drugs at the street level, because your experiences was at the street level as an undercover DEA agent, do you see today that differs from when you were a drug enforcement agent? And let's just focus on the type of drugs that are out there. Is there a difference from when you were fighting the war versus what's out there today?
Okay, I'm still involved. I'm actually the chairman of the Former Agents Association for the New England Field Division. So I stay in touch with a lot of the young guys and a lot of the older retired guys. And I just got off the phone as I was walking in here with one of the young supervisors, and we were talking about the trends, what's going on. And it's basically back when I was buying drugs. For example, we'll start with heroin, because I know there's it's
big epidemic
big
here
epidemic
in the South
here,
Shore.
big epidemic in our country, and a lot of overdose deaths. Back in the day when I was buying drugs from sizable dealers, the purity would be 3%. 3%. If you the highest you may get will be 7 or 8% heroin. Today it's very, very common, street level bags of heroin, 60%. And it's 60 to 90%. That's kind of unheard of. But the difference is, back in the 70s, it was all French Connection. It was all drugs. The only processing plants were in France, Marseille. So all the drugs, all the poppies had to go through Marseille, be turned into heroin. Today, the same heroin is right on our doorstep, Mexico, Colombia. Then they not only grow the poppies, but they have the processing plants. So that's the big difference. The big difference it shows because the price has gone down to next to nothing. You can buy heroin. You can get high on heroin today cheaper than you could buy a six-pack. And unfortunately, kids can't even buy a six-pack, so they'll go out in the street and for $5 get a hit of heroin.
Get a hit of heroin.
And heroin now is at an all-time low price-wise, even lower than cocaine right now. So I think I can tie all drugs together. All the drugs, despite all of our work, all of our efforts, are more plentiful today. The purity is higher, they're stronger. That's why you see all these overdose deaths, and the price is cheaper. A couple of years ago, there was a headline, I don't know if you saw it, front page of the Herald. They had a scene where one of the photographers got out of his car at the Boston Common, and there were some junkies on a blanket, and they were shooting up. And there was a woman, it was a sunny day, it was a bright sunny day, noontime, and she was pushing a carriage with a kid and a little child next to her. And I'm looking at it, and I thought to myself, I was buying heroin in the back alleys, dark rooms, and now here it is in the
Sunny
middle
day
of sunny day. Now, the one junkie who shot up died. I mean, he died right there. And I'm looking at him. It haunted me because I was at the Boston Police Academy that same day I saw the paper, and they were graduating some DEA officers, and I was with the commissioner at the time, and as I'm driving home, I see this paper. I picked it up, and I kept thinking of this. Why did it bother me so much? And I woke up the next morning, I realized I knew that kid who overdosed. I knew him when he was a little boy. I knew his dad.
Yeah.
And that's, it hit home.
It hit home.
Yeah. So that's, unfortunately...
Let's shift gears from the standpoint of the purity of the drugs and the type of drugs to, what is a concern within the neighborhoods, the violence, and the type of crimes that are taking place. In reading your book, you talked a little bit about the gangs in Chinatown, right. That were, distributing the drugs and so forth. What do you see out there today that, we should be aware of, basically as a community?
Well, it's even more violent than it was in those days. Now in my later days, I still spend a lot of time with at-risk people. I volunteer with Catholic Charities, and I work in conjunction with the Boston Police and the gang unit. We have they asked me to put together a boxing program for the kids in the inner city, and I go in there, and it's an area of the city of Boston which is high crime, high violence, a lot of shootings, a lot of deaths by drug overdose, and they're trying to make a difference by reaching out, and they're doing a wonderful job. This program that they have right now, it's it's called the St. Peter's Teen Center. To me, it's amazing because I see the commitment of the priests involved, from the police commissioner on down, with all the police that volunteer and drop in and mentor the kids, and the program itself, pretty impressive. They have the kids in after school. They tutor them, they feed them, and then they have at 7 o'clock they can play sports. They can play soccer. They can take cooking, they can box, they can take dancing. There's a number of, very good program. Actually, I was in New Jersey and New York with some local district attorneys, and they were asking me about the program. They'd like to copy it.
Good. Okay. And when we expand from the gangs and the violence and the crime that's out there, those type of programs actually roll into prevention and resources to fight those type of, keeping kids off the streets,
right.
From that perspective as well. What do you see happening in relationship to the courts, and the prison system in relationship to, dealers that are being convicted or users who end up, using but creating crime, picking up felonies? What do you see happening in the courts and the prisons?
I don't think I could really speak to that right now, about what's going on. But I think I can answer the question another way. As a law enforcement officer, obviously, I want to keep drugs off the street. I want to lock people up that are selling drugs. But my main concern is the people that are becoming addicted. And I think, people often ask me, what do you think is the most important thing? I've actually had people ask me, well, gee, you worked and you did that all this. Don't you feel like you're wasting your time? And I try to explain to them that you have to have that. If you didn't have the laws and the lawmen on the street, we'd be even more flooded. But I think there's a three-prong approach. I think you have to have law enforcement. You have to have prevention. You have to have treatment. But I think, in my experience, prevention is the most important thing. If you can reach out to these young people, and I don't know what the exact answer is, but I think you have to try to get a grassroots program where the parents, the brothers and sisters, the fathers and mothers will be examples to the kids and talk to them.
And that's difficult because when you look at what's happened over the last 20 years, where you've got, single parents, or you got both parents working, multiple jobs. You got, latchkey kids coming home from school.
Right.
It's really tough,
Right.
And, I mean, when we were kids, we used to get together every afternoon after school and play ball out in the ballpark.
Right.
You can't do that today because you're fearful something's going to happen out there.
Right. But I think that I've had an opportunity to speak to many groups, high school, college kids, when the book came out, a book tour, obviously, and I always ask them, groups, why did you start taking drugs, or why did you not start taking? I talk to kids, you don't take drugs, how come? And they'll tell. And I was with a fellow who actually is a professor at Notre Dame, and he's from East LA, a Mexican background. And he said to me, he said, my daddy was about 5 foot tall. And this guy's about 6'4", played football for Notre Dame. And he said to me, when I was a boy, I just respected my dad. And he told me, son, if you ever take drugs, I'm going to kick your...
Yeah.
And that resonated with him. And I find that most people, they're not looking to role models in the, contrary to what everybody thinks, football players, basketball players, or hockey players. They actually, fathers and mothers, grandparents, brothers and sisters can have an influence, because I see it. I get the response from kids. So I think there's hope in that sense.
Okay. Let me kind of, in one of the passages in your book, you mentioned that, the common myth that experimental use of illegal drugs is a harmless rite of passage that should not go unchallenged. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'll give you an example. Again, in the many talks I've done, I was talking to a group of parents in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Pretty
affluent community.
And a woman raised her hand, and she said, well, I think that this is just a rite of passage that my children are going to take part in, because I did. And I had to stop her. And first of all, that knocks me out every time I hear that. But I said, so you use drugs yourself? Yes, I did. And when? Back in the 60s. Well, back in the 60s, the PCP content of marijuana was 1% and 2%, maybe 3% at the highest. Today, without being doctored, the average PCP content is 9%, so it's 3 times as high.
Potent.
The DEA recently has been getting this hydroponic pot from originally from Canada, but now all local stuff, and it's as much as 60%. 60%. So figure out 60% THC content as opposed to 2 and 3%. And again,
that's the difference between our parents' marijuana
that's
versus
the difference.
what's on the street
the other
today.
thing is, I was never, as you could tell in the book, I didn't spend a lot of time, infiltrating marijuana people. I worked mostly in, organized crime and cartels and heroin, cocaine, LSD. But today, it's common knowledge that most of the rehab centers are full of high school age kids, and they're in there because of marijuana. So think about it. What's
that leads me to my next question: is that how would you respond with the recent changes in the Massachusetts law allowing for the legal use of medical marijuana, and then the minimization of the law allowing for possession of under 1 ounce to be basically a $100 fine?
Yeah, it's again, that's the way the country's leaning right now. That's the way the administration is moving. But I think that's a bad precedence. First of all, medical marijuana, you can always get Marinol. They have a pharmaceutical, but people don't want that because they want to smoke it. They want to be able to smoke it. And to me, that seems to be that there's something wrong in that logic. I don't want people that have cancer to suffer, and I don't think they should suffer. I think Marinol would be the key, but with a...
and that's a synthetic form of,
it's a pharmaceutical, it's a pill,
have the same effect of having a marijuana.
So I think it's a bad precedent, and I think you talk to any police officer, it's making a mockery of the law. Out of all the people that they've ticketed, you don't even have to show identification, and the majority of the people, the tickets are made up,
right,
non-existent people.
How does as a federal law enforcement officer, how does the contrast between what a state like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has done here, differ versus maybe what the federal laws are on the books, with dealing with something of this nature?
You mean the federal law? You mean regarding marijuana?
Yeah. Right.
Again, it was never my never my specialty, but the federal law would have precedence. So, and they've the head of the DEA in Boston right now, John Avenitis, is he made it clear. He's already made a statement. He was in the newspaper within the last month that that as far as he's concerned, the law hasn't changed. The federal law would take precedence, and they're going to enforce
prosecute
it.
and enforce to the fullest extent of that law. Okay. It was interesting in chapter 2 of your book, titled Chinatown, that you mentioned that you came in contact with a young woman, Mary Elizabeth McNulty, or Tootie, as you identified her as, and you described her as a bad junkie. And for our viewers out there, it struck me how painful it was for you to watch, this bad junkie, this person that you became to know and work with basically on the streets out there, basically go through that pain and suffering of the addiction that she had.
Yeah, I want to make it clear. I didn't, and you didn't mean it either. But she's not a bad person. She had a bad Jones. She was addicted severely, and to see her go through these cycles to me it was an education, because I lived in the same project that she did, in the D Street project in Southie. So I knew kids like that, and I could relate to her, and I saw what. When I would see her going through the sniffles and the sweats and the shakes, and then when she'd get the, she'd shoot up, and then she'd just start slurring her words and, pass out.
And I think that's an element of the addiction that, our parents out there, really can't comprehend on, even though they might be seeing it taking place right in front of them, And, what advice would you give to those parents who, are blind to the fact that this might be happening to someone in their family?
Yeah, I just think that parents have to. Actually, the DEA has a program called Lost Promises. Once a year, they invite parents and brothers and sisters and or children of people who've overdosed on drugs, and it's the most moving experience I've ever seen. I've been there a number of times, and you'll see on the screen they'll show a picture of a young person or an older person, successful, and then they'll put up died of heroin overdose on, and you say it doesn't make sense. Prom pictures, wedding pictures, and you look at these things, and it makes it real. And I've talked to a lot of parents, and they say. Matter of fact, you remember the Celtics basketball sign?
Chris Curran?
No. Well, another good guy,
Okay.
but overdosed on cocaine.
Oh, Len Bias.
Len Bias.
Yes.
If you ever get the opportunity to see his mom speak, I mean, I talked to her face to face, and she says, she always says that people. Are in denial. You can't be in denial. She lost her other son in a shooting incident. She said she never dreamed that her children would be involved in drugs. She said you have to know that they will be or they can be, and you've got to be vigilant. And you don't have to be a sneaky snoop, but you can talk to your kids. If you have communication, just try to talk to them all the time and ask them. You'd be surprised what your kids will tell you, or what you can gather when you're with your children and their friends. I've got 4 children. They're grown, but I've got 9 grandchildren, and I've had my kids come to me and say to me, "Dad, I was so glad when you told me I couldn't go to that sleepover. I couldn't go to that, And I'm looking at them, and they didn't want to go, but they acted like they did.
Right.
But they were afraid to be put in that. And a lot of kids feel the same way. I've gone on retreats with a lot of young people, and that's the main thing. They say, my parents never. They told me that they wanted me to experience life and go, and see what it was all about. So I figured it was okay to do this stuff. And that's what I think the problem is with legalization. Once you legalize drugs, they're going to say, well, gee, the parents have given us the go-ahead. They must have studied this. There must be research. As opposed to my time with Tootie and the other people like her, I just had such a great empathy that I can't imagine ever lightening up on the.
No, it's a tough thing to witness and watch when you have a loved one going through that phase. You really don't understand it yourself to a certain extent.
That goes, as I said before, the most important thing I believe is prevention, because once somebody's addicted, the rehabs, they're great, but as many people that I've been involved in interventions, and in almost every case the people relapse, and sometimes they come back.
All the experts, relapse is a form of recovery.
Yeah,
it's part of recovery, I'm sure.
Right,
it's a part of the recovery process.
But it's a lifelong recovery.
Right.
And I think statistically, not 1 in 10 will stay off of the drug.
We got about 2 minutes left in our show here, and I had one other point of your book that you identified in, and that was you stated that junkies are ingenious when it comes to getting a fix. What should a family member look out for if they think suspect their child is involved in drugs? How ingenious can they be around that?
Yeah,
house?
well, I can't even count the ways but you got to watch everything, and that's the tragedy of the parents that I saw. They realized afterwards, after they found their child dead of an overdose, or the police showed up and said they found their son or their daughter dead, and they realized, gee, why didn't I notice that they always needed money? Why didn't I look in their eyes? Well, I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid to ask or I didn't want to be judgmental. So I think you have to. The main thing is, as your kids are growing up, you got to try to talk to them as much as you can. Try to get that conversation going and build a trust between you, and watch their friends. That's the unfortunate. You can be the best parent in the world, and all they have to do is meet one wayward guy or girl, and it changes everything.
One overnight, one party, one after-school event, something of that nature.
Right.
It can happen anywhere.
And the drugs today are so powerful, they can't come back. I want to say that heroin is an epidemic, methamphetamine also. Not as much in this part of the country as other parts, but it's rising, and the meth is so strong. One hit, and it's a lifelong battle. So all I can say is you got to keep your eyes open all the time.
One message to our parents out there, what would it be?
Yeah. One message?
Yes, one message to our parents. Yeah.
Just love your children. Let them know that you love them, and let them know that you're their parent and not their friend. And that's basically
a good point.
Yeah.
A lot of times we tend to want to be friends with our children, and we need to be parents, from that perspective. Well, we're pretty much all set here. I do want to, again, let everybody know that Hot Shots, Heavy Hits, Paul Doyle, fantastic read. If you're a Boston born and raised boy, as I was growing up, I identify with a lot of these areas in this book. So Paul, I want to thank you for coming on here and sharing some of your experiences.
Thanks for having me. Yep. I
and on behalf of all of us here at Deadly Silence, we hope to see you at our next episode. Thank you.